All right, so today at the Fullerton Observer podcast, we have an interview with Ruthi Hanchett. Ruthi is a PDA leader and a mom with 2 kids in the Fullerton School District, and she has been a global leader and advocate in the field of children's and women's rights, human trafficking, and gender equality for over 20 years. We'll get more into some of the other work that you have been doing, but first of all, thank you so much, Ruthi, for being here today.
You're welcome.
And I really appreciate you giving us your time because I know you're very busy as an adjunct professor and a mom and doing all this work that you're doing in the community. And now you're also running for the Fullerton School District Board of Trustees, Area 4, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. In November was when the election will be.
It's exciting. So good luck for that.
Thank
but
you.
I really want to talk about some of your work today, and maybe we'll get to the elections later in
Sure.
the interview if we have time. So first, let's get started with human trafficking in Orange County specifically. Like, what does it look like? And then in more, just honing it down to the Fullerton area.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to get exact numbers when we talk about human trafficking, or modern day slavery is another way that we refer to this, because people don't come out in the open with what they're doing, right? It's a hidden crime, and it oftentimes can be happening right under our noses, and we won't notice it or understand it. So when we step back and then try to zoom in on what it looks like here in Fullerton, I think it helps to think about there are 40 million people in the world today engaged in modern day slavery. When we think about the United States, we have to go off the data we know from those who are receiving help, right? We don't know all that are engaged in exploitation and abuse, but we know that right now, the last hotline numbers that we had were about 10,000 cases in the last year that have been reported and helped through through human trafficking hotline in the United States. And then when we look at Orange County, in the last couple of years, we've helped about 450 victims of human trafficking here in Orange County. And again, the number of people that are being exploited and abused is much bigger. Those are just the funds that we're finding and able to support with services. So then when we think about Fullerton, we know the same conditions that make people vulnerable around the country, around the county, are here in Fullerton. And those are things like poverty, inequality, children that have been sexually abused, those who are involved in the child care welfare system, new immigrants without a lot of security. So people like that are very vulnerable, and that's our community. So we know that it's happening, and we've even seen specific cases of that happening in Fullerton.
Because this is something that when we think about human trafficking, we think it's kind of far from us.
Yeah.
It's an international problem.
Yeah.
People don't realize that those are the high numbers happening in Fullerton. Those are what's been reported. But then what about that's not being reported at all?
Yeah. And even in Orange County, the majority of the people that are being found and helped are U.S. residents, citizens, people who are born and raised here. So yes, we have people who are brought into the United States, sometimes specifically for the purpose of being exploited in trafficking, sometimes people who are new immigrants, and that vulnerability of their immigration status is used against them as a way of controlling and abusing them. But it absolutely happens to everyone in our community. I mean, when I say everyone, people who are vulnerable in our community, and even including our children here.
Right, and that's pretty tragic.
Yeah.
So how do you recognize a victim of human trafficking? What are the most common signs, and what should we do once we suspect that someone is being trafficked?
Yeah, great questions. There's no one way to know, right? I wish there was. I wish there was a checkbox and we could tick it and know. So we have to pay attention to people, and especially looking at vulnerabilities can kind of help us focus in on who is most likely to be exploited and abused. So we can look at kind of 2 things. Usually we talk about human trafficking in 2 ways. There's sexual exploitation, that's sex trafficking. It's also the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which is a more descriptive way of talking about the abuse that children suffer in exploitation. But we also have labor trafficking, right? And so those aren't always really clear, distinct groups. Sometimes someone is exploited in both ways. For instance, domestic servitude is a really common way that people in the United States are exploited in labor trafficking. Oftentimes it looks like women and girls that may be working in a home as a maid, a nanny. It could even be a male person working in a home as a nurse's aide, like a nursing home situation. But they may also be sexually abused and exploited even in commercial sex. So sometimes those categories aren't so clear cut. And people can be, once a person is literally owned by another person, they can be exploited and abused in many ways, right? But if we think about those kind of 2 general categories, we can think about who's vulnerable and how are they used to kind of help us understand what might be those identifiers or those red flags. So when we think about labor trafficking, it's oftentimes people who may not be able to leave the places where they're working. They, for instance, might live and work in the same place. One of the very first cases in Southern California was a case in El Monte where people were being trafficked into the United States, held in an apartment, working in sweatshops, and never allowed to leave. And some of the signs, physical signs, was there was fencing around the apartment building and razor wire to keep people in, not out. And so, and no one came in and out of that building other than maybe a few people to move products in and out. But the people lived and worked and stayed at that property. In the same way, if you notice, people in the back of a restaurant that never come to the front and aren't engaging with the public. I mean, it could be a lot of reasons, but sometimes it's paying attention to those signs of someone who may not be able to speak for themselves, who is continually kind of watched and monitored by someone else. That's really important when we think about people seeking help. When doctors are able to talk to perhaps a victim, because maybe they've come in because they've got an injury from working in a restaurant and they burned themselves, or they've been beaten, because traffickers, abusers oftentimes use physical violence to control their victims. So if they present themselves at the emergency room, but someone else is right there and won't leave them alone, maybe they pretend to be their interpreter or their family member, but it's really important for us to get them alone, to have that opportunity to build trust and ask kind of what's going on. Why do you have these untreated injuries? Where did this, strangulation marks come from? Things like that can be real big signs, indicators. But when we talk about sexual exploitation, it's really important when we think about, especially looking at our young people, some of the signs and the indicators could be, really, it's any child that's involved in commercial sex. And that could look like dating for profit. A lot of times these dating apps and kind of sugar daddy, sugar baby relationships are growing as a trend right now. So when there's that imbalance of power dynamics, that can be a way of exploitation, and that can be a sign. But oftentimes we see teenagers that will miss out on school on Friday and Monday because they're being sold by their traffickers for sex on the weekend. That girl might still be coming to school. But if we see signs like, she's dressed differently, inappropriately for the weather or the situation, if she's got branding, tattooing is really common, where a trafficker will literally put his name or a symbol or sign on a woman's body, usually a woman or a girl, to show ownership, just like a branding of an animal. Those can be signs. If a girl especially suddenly has her hair and nails done in a way that just is inconsistent with her normal behavior, oftentimes traffickers are literally marketing a product. And so they'll dress her up. It's a real human being. But that commercial element of it is where we see that in play.
Right. So that's a lot of different signs that we can look out for, but they're not necessarily the easiest things to see, right?
Because we really have to be paying attention to people, right? And there's no one sign, but it's really, I always tell people to trust their gut. If they know, this person I knew is suddenly different, or especially if it's someone like a child, suddenly withdrawn, new friends groups, they have 2 cell phones, secret communication. Those can all be indicators. But if you see someone on the street and you just get a feeling, or you see someone in a place of business and it feels not right, I think the most important thing, again, is trust your gut. Like, if you can, try to create a human connection with that person. But the important thing is we don't want to step in as law enforcement, right? That's not our job. What we can do is instead call the human trafficking hotline. So that number for all of the United States is 888-37-37-888. That's our national human trafficking hotline. It's available 24/7 in pretty much all the languages. And what they do is they can answer questions. You can report things anonymously, but they keep a record. So if they have had multiple tips, like let's say about a restaurant where it's just strange that people are working in the back, and I heard some yelling and people just seemed uncomfortable, you could call. And then if it's the third time someone's called about this restaurant, maybe then they investigate. Or if it's a nail salon that all the windows are closed and people aren't, only see men going in and out of a nail salon, that's another red flag, right? So then if it's the third or fourth or fifth call, maybe that means they're investigating, and you're just adding to the evidence that will be used in a court to prosecute that trafficker. But it's important that we can inadvertently even mess up an investigation or a process that may be underway. So if we call, we want to remember as many details as possible. And I always say it's better to trust your gut and just make the phone call than to possibly miss the opportunity to truly save someone's life or make a difference in their freedom. So if you have any feelings, call the hotline. hotline. You can even call the local police and ask for a welfare check is another way to do it. But it can be anonymous, and that's the best way to ensure that you are acting on any kind of suspicions that you have.
Right, so there's things that we can do, and there
Absolutely.
are resources that are available, and I'm sure Justin's going to put the number on the screen that you
That'd
just
be great.
provided us. So thank you for sharing that.
And
that is actually really helpful.
I should say that there's also a text. You can also text to, and it's Be Free is kind of the letter version of the text, right?
Yeah.
Be Free. And you can text, especially, that's really helpful. I think a lot of young people would prefer that. If you're in a kind of an awkward situation where you feel like picking up the phone right now might put someone in danger, or it's just not comfortable, you can text really, anonymously and very secretively. So that's a great way to also be in connection. And they also have, even online on their website, you can connect that way too.
Right, so there's a lot of different ways that people can connect depending on their situation.
Yes.
So, you mentioned earlier that we have to kind of pay attention, right?
Yeah.
But in this day and age of social media,
Yes.
no one really does. So I did want to ask, how does social media impact, human trafficking?
Yeah, in so many ways.
Right.
In the ways that it's shaped our world, it's shaped the issue of human trafficking. But the number one thing I would say is that the number one red light district of our time is the internet.
Right.
It is the place where victims are recruited. It is the place where people are bought and sold.
Right.
So in the sense that social media is a platform, is a way of communicating, it has become a place where victims of trafficking are recruited and bought and sold for sex primarily. But the internet is also a way that we are connected with a global economy. So when we think about, I as a consumer here in Fullerton may inadvertently buy products picked by slaves, grown by slaves, harvested by slaves, produced by slaves in countries around the world.
Right.
And so as a consumer, we can use that tool of the internet to do research and learn, but it's also what connects us to people and this global economy where we oftentimes are privileged and benefiting from the exploitation of others without even knowing it. Right. So there's so many ways, but I think another really important connection that oftentimes people don't see is the way that the social media and the internet really gives access to versions of commercial sexual exploitation. So we're seeing really huge trends in, like I said, online dating apps being a place of exploitation and abuse, a place of recruitment. Sugar dating is I'm sure you've seen on college campuses, it's growing as a trend. It's presented this kind of mutual relationship where usually it's younger girls and boys, but have a relationship with someone who's older, more financially established, maybe takes them traveling, buys them handbags, or pays for their lifestyle, pays off student debt. But unfortunately, it oftentimes represents a really unhealthy power dynamic that can turn into exploitation. And we're even seeing traffickers recruit young people, bring them into these relationships, and then flip around and turn and sell them as their traffickers on these same dating websites. So it's really a dangerous trend that I think young people aren't always aware of. And it's becoming really normalized. You see TikTok videos and all these kind of top 10 tips on how to be a sugar baby. And it's really normalized in our commercial, our culture without talking about the harms and the risks that are involved with it.
Exactly.
And I would say the same thing for pornography, because we know that oftentimes pornography is just documentation of people's sexual exploitation. Right. Trafficking victims will tell us that pornography was made of them while they were sex trafficking victims. Right. And it's even used as a tool to desensitize victims, to say hey, you're going to do this, and instruct them what to do when they're then sold in prostitution. Right. And we see that it drives the demand for sex trafficking as well, because people that consume pornography oftentimes will not want to act out what they see with maybe someone they're in relationship with, so instead will choose to purchase sex, which then drives that demand for more victims to fill in the demand for sex trafficking victims. Right. So there's all kinds of ways that social media is just fueling this demand for sex trafficking, facilitating labor exploitation of others, and it's a huge problem. Right. Which is why one of the reasons I'm running for school board is I really think that we need to equip young people to understand these risks. To growing up in a digital age, to know, yes, these are powerful tools, we can use them for good, but we also need to know the risks and the vulnerabilities and navigate those, and put up barriers, not just because it's we don't go there, but really understanding why it's harmful, both whether it's for ourselves or for the others, the victims that are on the other side of the screen.
Got it. And now that you've mentioned that, it brings to mind that on Instagram and Twitter, I've personally gotten a lot of different DMs from older ladies and older men saying, would you like to be my sugar baby? I'll pay you $500 a week. I'll pay you $1,000 a week. And obviously I just block him, but it's a large amount. It's not just one or two every once in a while. I get a lot of those, and so do all of my friends, and we just tend to ignore it. But I'm sure some people reply.
What if you were in a vulnerable place and needed that money for rent?
Exactly.
Or your family needed it for rent, and you think, I can just get away with a date and, I don't have to do anything. But it's that pressure. And I mean, forget about if there's violence or abuse involved, but even just that economic pressure that really leads to an exploitive relationship.
Let me just fix your mic real quick.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
I tend to talk with my hands, so I might be knocking it over. I'm not sure.
I think it's the table being lean as well. It's not helping either. But social media. It's
another major piece. I love that you said that, because I work with college students, right? And then we actually go out to high schools and we talk to a lot of high schoolers to create awareness of human trafficking, because I just believe in this so much. And that we need to empower young people to understand these issues. And every single one, when we say, like, who's gotten those DMs, whether it's to be a sugar baby or send nudes is the other big thing, right? To sell what's technically called self-generated child abuse images, right? But it's the nude selfies. People are asking for those constantly, and every single teenager's received them. I think adults, parents like my age, don't know that, right? And so we have to give guidance on how to handle those situations and why it's harmful and why it's not going to be a safe option just for a quick way to make money. But I was going to say also, I love that social media can be a really positive tool for bringing awareness, right? So my college students, we put out information on social media. I have students come to Vanguard, where I teach now, who say, I learned about trafficking online, and so I'm really grateful that they're learning. It's just that oftentimes we have to also counter myths, because there's a lot of misinformation about trafficking and the way it happens and who it happens to that we also need to address.
Right. So social media is a double-edged sword. It could be a force of good and it's a force of
evil. It's a tool. It depends on how we use it.
Right. Yeah. So one thing that brings to mind is, what kind of social media accounts do you help run? Like, what should people be following that should show up on their feeds and give them more accurate, reliable information?
Okay, that's good. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is run by Polaris Project, is a great place for really accurate data based on the United States, based on the calls that they're getting, the victims that they're finding. So that's a great one to follow and to learn about. I work with the Global Center for Women and Justice out of Vanguard University, and a lot of what we do is around trafficking prevention and awareness and training. And then Live to Free is the student club that I mentor and lead there. So those are some local groups to support, and especially from an academic perspective. I'd love to share. I'm running for school board, and so you can find me on Instagram, Ruthi Hanchett for school board on Instagram and Facebook, as just someone who wants to bring this message to our local schools in Fullerton, and especially junior high is too late. We need to start really early to talking about not necessarily all these details, but really talking about autonomy and body safety, and that kids are control of their bodies, so that they understand what's appropriate and what's not, what's safe and what's not, and how to have an ongoing trusted relationship with adults that they can turn to when they need help.
Yeah, so you've already mentioned this a little bit, but as much evil is being done in Orange County, there are also a lot of anti-trafficking organizations that you are a big part of. What are some of those organizations and groups that are actively working towards ending human trafficking?
So I mentioned a national with the Polaris Project. I love in Orange County, some of the leaders. We have the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, which is a collective group of multiple agencies, including law enforcement, government, those who work with social services for child welfare, but a lot of nonprofits and even faith-based groups that work with them. Some of the leaders of that include Waymakers, which is based out, it's throughout Orange County. A lot of our police departments throughout Orange County, but also the Salvation Army is another major player that does a lot of support for victim services after victims are found here in Orange County. I've done some work with them as well as a consultant, developing curricula for their staff around the globe, because they do work, they've been doing this kind of work for literally hundreds of years now. But then when we look at Fullerton specifically, there's some, and I should mention Orangethorpe is another one, Orangewood Children's Foundation, in Santa Ana is another one that does a lot of this grid work. But then in Fullerton, we have some great organizations. So Crittenton is one that I love that works with youth especially, and those who are aging out, kind of that transitional age, who are also very vulnerable or who may have experienced commercial sexual exploitation. WTLC, Women's Transitional Living Center, also serves survivors of human trafficking. And those issues of domestic violence and human trafficking are very much interrelated, and oftentimes victims will experience both, because human trafficking often looks like a romantic relationship, right? An intimate partner relationship that then is also a form of exploitation and in that sort of abuse. So they do some great work supporting both survivors and their families and serving the community, creating more awareness in that work. The Salvation Army also has a home here in Orange County that is connected with survivors here in Fullerton. What else? We've got great organizations that do what I would call more kind of like intersectional and supportive work. So OC United, I know you interviewed Jade recently, and they work with youth, with homelessness issues, with women who have experienced intimate partner violence. Those are all issues that intersect and make people more vulnerable to exploitation and human trafficking, and new immigrant communities. So Camino Immigration Services is another organization here in Fullerton that serves immigrants and asylum seekers and helping them with their legal adjustment. So that, it can be a way to keep people safe and prevented from being exploited and trafficked. I know California State University of Fullerton has the Center for Healthy Neighborhoods. They do a lot of great work. I've spoken with their groups a couple of times about just creating awareness with more parents and community groups about what human trafficking is and how to prevent it. And I know groups like the Fullerton Collaborative and Fullerton Act are groups I've even shared with. And I think that they're, again, working in community to support those who are most vulnerable in our community, who are most at risk of trafficking, so that we're taking a preventative approach rather than trying to solve the problem after the fact, right? So I think those are some of the specific groups I wanted to make sure. But again, Pathways of Hope that addresses food insecurity and homelessness. Along with that would be Habitat for Humanity. Solidarity works again with young youth who are maybe vulnerable. Hoya Scholars, again, giving kids an opportunity for an excellent education. All of these groups, Boys and Girls Club, all the groups that are working with those vulnerable populations are giving them protective. That's how we ensure protection, and that's how we ensure that these people are not exploited and abused.
Right. So we have groups that are working at one end of the issue, trying to solve and save the victims, but then we have groups that are attacking the root of the problem, which might be
preventative.
Preventative. So that's great that we have all this work being done so locally, in Fullerton. Because I think when we think of these organizations, we think of more of them being just donation based, but I think having Jay Williams here, OC United, he kind of talked about how much volunteers that they need, how many different projects they're involved in across communities, and how it can look like your 1 hour a week, your 2 hours a week can make a real difference. So
absolutely. And I think it isn't donation based. Donations are great.
Yes,
right? We need the money to keep going.
Uh-huh.
When we think about what especially keeps young people safe and preventative, oftentimes it's healthy, connected relationships, And so when people volunteer, when they have staff who are trauma-informed and understand these issues and are investing in young people's lives, I think that's what really makes the difference. And so that's not a quick fix. That's not something you can just write a check for. It's something that it takes investment. And especially when it's vulnerable youth who maybe don't have that at home in a parent relationship, it takes other healthy adults investing in them.
Right. So it takes your time, energy, commitment.
Yeah.
Those are some of the things that you can really donate along with your money and try to get some of these
and I know
issues
Crittenton and WTLC, especially Crittenton is always welcoming volunteers, and some of the others like Solidarity and others that OC United that work with young people especially.
Right. So this would be a great time to get involved in some of these things. So we've been in a pandemic for seems like an eternity. I'm sure that made working for anti-trafficking a lot harder. How did that really affect human trafficking in this community, and how did that affect your work trying to combat it?
Yeah, well, we all shifted in some ways, but I think when we think about especially the early days of the pandemic, there were kind of three ways. One was that I think it it immediately stopped and reduced services to the people who needed it. Right. We know like some of our shelters shut down because those are oftentimes rotating residents, and they just couldn't, in the early days we didn't know what was, how it was spread, how to stay safe. And so some of those literally just stopped. And then what we've seen over the last few years is the growth in just vulnerability. The factors that made people vulnerable to human trafficking, like economic insecurity, food insecurity, homelessness, those just increased, right, during the pandemic. And still, if we think about globally, are still growing. Right now, we know there are more children in child labor than there were before the pandemic. Even though for years and years we've been getting better and better at reducing children in exploitation and abuse, it has gone up since the pandemic because so many families are insecure. And so child labor is a alternative. It's their coping mechanism, as well as like young girls being sold as brides, as a coping mechanism to deal with starvation in their families, right? So globally, we've seen the vulnerabilities, and in the United States and here in Fullerton, only increase. And a third is, unfortunately, we saw this technology shift, which, we all went on Zoom, right? We did school on Zoom, business meetings on Zoom, but the traffickers did too. So what we saw was just a shifting in the way that people were being exploited. Being creative. We actually saw traffickers setting up, like triangulating abusive situations where children were maybe even being recruited. Because think about it, every teenager's online in their rooms, especially during the kind of lockdown situation. Everyone was turning to social media as an outlet, right? A way to stay connected. So traffickers took advantage of that. They said, I know you're lonely. I'm here for you. Built these trust kind of relationships, and then turned around and said, if you do this for me, if you love me, you'll do this. And then they were literally profiting, making money off of the sexual exploitation of someone that may have never even physically met. So we saw, especially children being abused online, through webcams, through live kind of situations by traffickers that weren't even physically with them, and making money off maybe a third party paying for that. So unfortunately, I don't know that will even necessarily get better, because now that they found that avenue, it's there, So we need to work to increase awareness, to go after them, to investigate, for our law enforcement to have the tools to do this. But we also, as parents, as educators, as young people, need to create more awareness of these issues so that we are protecting and keeping our kids safe.
Right. And I think you just mentioning the fact that people are being recruited online when they were trying to find an outlet for social connection, that just made me so sad. So I'm sorry if I zoned out for a second, but I'm just thinking that the pandemic was hard as is. It is hard as is. I don't think we need this added layer of stress on it. But now that I'm thinking, all these young people who may have gotten affected are currently getting affected. What can their parents do? I mean, you can't control everything your child's doing on the internet. You may not have time for that. You're working. What do you even do?
It's tough, right? It's tough. And I feel like, I'm 42 this next month. No one taught me how to do this. I'm having to figure out as a parent, because this wasn't the challenge we had, right? Like didn't exist. This technology is new. So we're all figuring it out. So it's not to put blame on parents, but to say like, we need our best resources. We need to be brainstorming. We need to partner with young people so that they tell us, and we bring our wisdom, but they're the ones, they're the ones that know what it's like to be on TikTok as a teenager, right? So we have to understand that. That's one thing I love partnering with my students is I say like, how would you say this to a teenager? Because they're not going to say, don't do it. They're going to say, okay, here's how you stay safe, or here's the risks, and let's be careful that we're not like running into those, So I think it takes a multi-layered approach. I think that, one, our schools need to do better about really enabling students to understand how to stay safe online. So that's one of the reasons I'm running for school board, is to really look at there's things we can do on the IT side of barring and filtering and making sure kids aren't going to sites that aren't appropriate or not helpful for education, right? But then there's also, we need to equip young people to understand the risks and how to stay safe. And we also need to teach parents. And we need to teach parents just to be in their kids' business, to pay attention, to be, if they're on an app, you be on an app too. And you follow your kid and you make sure you're in that communication. And simple things like you just it's hard, but keeping phones out of kids' bedrooms late at night so that they're not on, you're asleep and they're online talking with who knows who until 2 a.m, right? Because kids need boundaries. And so I think, but it's also about teaching them how to set their own boundaries so they understand the risks and the reasons they're wanting to stay safe. So it's less about the no, and more just like, it reminds me of a preschool book my kids read, right? You don't teach teenagers like preschoolers, but you enable them, you work with them developmentally to help them know the risks and to stay safe. You think about like if someone's really feeling vulnerable, like it's natural to want to reach out and find connection, you know?
And if somebody is pretending to be someone that cares about you, whether it be through you know, a dating app or a social media app, then, you know, a lot of us have online friendships. I have online friends that I have, maybe I knew them from elementary school, but I don't know how they grew up. Or just people that I don't know, I've only seen maybe one time in my life. And the pandemic kind of made that normalized, because it was just like, well, I'm not going to see them, might as well just talk to them. But, you know, there's just so much that goes into it, and I'm just now realizing all of that.
Well, I think that's where we even have to talk about educating young people about, like, what is a healthy, well, not just young people, everybody, what's a healthy relationship look like? You know, it's someone who tries to isolate you, who tries to control you, who, you know, gives you direction of what you can and cannot do. Like, that's not healthy. But, you know, sometimes it takes a while, obviously, for that to be revealed, but helping people know, like, if you see this, you get out, you know, and you don't owe loyalty to anyone that's going to try to manipulate and use and abuse you that way, you know? Yeah.
And I think this conversation is an example of conversations that people could be having after learning from these resources, because now that I think about it, you know, social media apps like Instagram, Facebook have options to restrict certain users. So they don't know you've restricted them, but you have. Or to block them, and that is a bit more obvious, but you could restrict people. And I think that's the one thing that I usually do to these DMs, is I'll just restrict people that are making me feel uncomfortable.
For sure. Yeah, we used to always say, like, don't be friends with anyone online that you're not friends with in real life.
That's a great tip too.
But I think that's, like you said, it is harder during the pandemic, and especially as, you know, it's such a global society. So people do form communities and connections with people across the globe. I think the question would be then, at least I'd say, don't meet up with that person online, right? But even if you think, well, my friend is a friend with them, so it's probably okay. Like, your friend might have accepted their friendship and not know them either. So that can't always be an indicator that someone's safe.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all these online gaming communities that I'm not really part of, but you're talking on the phone a lot. You know, you're connected through your headphones. You may have never seen them, but there's that audio connection. And you can talk for hours and hours and hours to this person. I have no idea who they are or where they're sitting.
And we've seen predators take advantage of that. And even pedophiles and groomers come after young children, and starting with the conversation of, it's just about the game, and then it's, oh, what school do you go to? Oh, what neighborhood are you in? Oh, we should meet up sometime. And then it turns into, you know, just this exploitation.
Yeah, and this is a little random, but that's also how a lot of terrorist organizations will recruit young men who are playing violent games. That's how I first got to know about it.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's a lot. So, you know, I want to kind of get apart from the tragic issue of it and get to the solutions a little bit. So we've discussed how parents can protect young children and teenagers, right? How can we get the youth engaged and involved in the prevention of human trafficking for themselves and for the community?
Yeah, I love this, because my career has been about engaging young people in issues that affect them, right? And I think naturally, especially younger kids, like I have elementary school age kids, you know, they have this strong sense of what's fair and right? Like they want justice. They want things to be fair for everybody. And so I think just like nurturing that innate, you know, desire for justice, for care, for like, hey, that's not okay that someone is treated this way, and nurturing like they have a voice and they can stand up and make a difference is really important. So for me as a parent, that's my philosophy, is like, how do I just nurture and engage that in my kids, whether it's something super small, you know, my kids have been talking about how there's no recycling at their school and they want to add recycling cans, you know, so it's like I want them to have the life experience of like, I can do something about this. I don't just have to say, oh, that's too bad, but make change, right? And see what that feels like when it does work. So when I work with my college students and we work with high schoolers, it's really about helping them understand the influence they have on their peers too, and that their voice matters. So one of my favorite things is my college students will always do an advocacy day where we'll literally call like our senators or congress people and, you know, make the phone call about whether it's a bill that's up or an issue that we want to raise. I give them that experience of like, it really matters, and your call, it's not that hard, it's not that scary, and it matters. And I think we've gone to marches and we've gone to events and we've volunteered with survivors and with organizations to give them those experiences that it really does matter. And what I love is they are so creative. Like my college students, we started a couple years ago a fair trade fashion show at Vanguard University, and it's October 20th this year.
Right.
Everyone's invited. It's really fun. But
Awesome.
one of the things we wanted to do was draw attention to the fact that fashion industry is one of the worst industries for exploitation. Sweatshops,
Right.
you think about like child labor, exploitation, so rather than continuing to support that, we've talked about fair trade fashion and alternative fashions and recycling and upcycling clothing and reusing it so that we're not continually feeding into that just exploitive process. So, they were like the first people I knew to do something like that. And I love their creativity. It's like this big event now. It's so much fun. So I think that when young people realize that they can be creative in the way that they address these social problems, that it matters. Like so many of my students come to our club, our classes on human trafficking, because they've experienced either themselves or someone they love has been a victim. Maybe they were, abused to the point where they thought, okay, that could have been me. It was one step removed. Or maybe it was a friend that was commercially sexually exploited. But it feels close. And so I think when they have that personal just like commitment, they just have a passion, and so I want to give them avenues to see that it matters and they can make a difference.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot that the youth can do to
Yes.
get engaged, and we
Yes.
can get
And
really creative.
And I think just teaching their peers, my college students go out and teach high schoolers. We've taught junior hires, just creating that awareness so that they are engaged, like they are more safe. They're telling their peers. We talk about like, you may not be at risk, but maybe your friend is. So you talk to her, So,
Right.
So just creating that kind of way of looking out for one another, which then keeps them safe as well.
Right. So let's recap some
Yes.
of the steps that we have talked about, because
Yeah.
we've talked about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So first we talked about once you see someone
Mm-hmm.
and you really have to trust your gut and you can make these calls to hotlines.
Yes.
Then we talked about how there's a lot of local organizations, you can get involved with your time, money, energy, commitment.
Yes.
And then you can also get creative,
Yeah.
use the social media.
Yes.
Use the fashion shows, go into these other avenues, and you can try and spread more awareness about this, get the youth involved. So I think it's so fantastic that you're sharing all of these different ways that we can get involved, because there is really something that everyone can contribute.
Absolutely.
Right? Because we often think that
Yeah.
you have to be some sort of an expert in
no.
this, but you don't.
No, I think, you do the research and find those trusted organizations, like I've mentioned some of the nonprofits that are trustworthy in the information that we're sharing. But then, whatever it is that is your passion, your skills, your life experiences, bring those to bear on this issue. And we talked about those kind of intersectional issues. If you love youth, maybe it's volunteering with foster care, kids involved with foster care. If you are more, even business side, maybe it's supporting like economic opportunities for single women who maybe are at risk, or maybe it's making sure that if you have influence over a business, like looking at what are your supply chains look like, what is the fair practices, how are you paying people, especially in developing nations, like what does that look like at the way that you're treating others, and how does that, what power do you have to make sure everyone is paid a living wage, a fair wage?
Right, and I think now you can also kind of tell there are other websites that will vet certain, outlets online, and you can also kind of just judge by the way that if you look at, say, Shane's website, they're about us. You're not going to find out much of where these clothes are coming from. Whereas if you look at a website like Everlane or something a bit more sustainable, a bit more ethical, they'll have the 20-page story of where they're getting everything from.
Yeah, and there's fair trade corporations, and there's apps that you can even use as a consumer. The Sweat and Toil app is put out by a U.S. government agency that looks at where your products come from, especially like produce when you're shopping at the grocery store. Another one is Good on You, is one that assesses clothing to, again, talk about ethical practices and whether they're fair trade, or at least, working towards better practices for their labor.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways that we can learn and continually improve ourselves on our avenues in life. So I'm just so glad we're doing this episode. So who else do you think we should be talking about on this podcast to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, I think obviously this podcast is focused on local, issues and leaders in the community. So I think that there's a lot you could do to look at those organizations that are working on this issue here in Fullerton. So like I mentioned, WTLC, Mark Lee, the CEO there, or others that work specifically focused in on human trafficking would be great for the podcast. Crittenton, that works with youth and families here in the community. They serve a lot of kids who are vulnerable or have experienced commercial sexual exploitation. And my colleague, actually I have a colleague who works at Vanguard University, Kendra Tenkersley Davis, is an adjunct professor with me, and she works at Crittenton. So she'd be a great interview. Thinking about Camino Immigration Services is another that serves asylum seekers and others who are seeking immigration status support, and they have worked with trafficking survivors. There's a visa specifically called the Trafficking Visa, Trafficking Victims Visa, that's specifically to help victims of trafficking that desire to stay here in the United States, especially as their case is prosecuted.
Right.
So Bethany Anderson, who leads that group, would be good. I think there are survivors here in Fullerton. Ori Freeman is a woman who is a survivor of human trafficking. She was attending Fullerton High School when she was being trafficked by her pimp on our streets. And so she is now an advocate against human trafficking, speaks on the issue in a lot of different venues, and she'd be amazing. She's an amazing person and would be a great interview as well.
I graduated from Fullerton High School, and it's just the local connections. That's why we make this podcast focus on local people, because the kind of connections you find, you would never imagine. So I'm thankful for this list, and we'll definitely look more into it.
Great.
But if you have a little bit more time, I do want to get into your election run now.
Yeah, sure.
So you're running for school board in Fullerton District 4. What made you decide school board?
Well, as you can see, I'm very passionate about this topic, right? So for me, I have such a desire to support our kids. And I think this topic specifically of child protection and engaging, especially how we engage online with our kids, with the tablets that we give them as a Fullerton School District, is really at the top of my list. And that was so that, it's something I wanted to be engaged with. And so serving on the board is certainly a way that I can have some opportunity to make change in that way. And just the way that we approach this topic. And, not to say that we aren't doing things well, I just think we can do better. I think we can do more to support our students, our teachers, and our families in this work. And so that's a major reason. I previously to working just locally on human trafficking, I worked at World Vision International, where I focused on children's rights and well-being, including education at an international level. So I was an advocate for children. I would go to the UN and the World Bank and the U.S. Congress and advocate why we needed to focus on, funding for children's education around the world. And so this just feels like a natural way for me to bring those same skills and experiences to our community and to really help our kids. And I'm a mom. I have 2 kids in the district. It's very personal, and I love their kids, their friends, our community at Raymond Elementary, where my kids go to school. And it's a way for me to continue to serve our community.
Yeah, and as you said, we can always do better. It's not that things aren't being done, but we can always add to it. And I think your experience doing this kind of stuff internationally with the UN, World Bank, U.S. Congress, all of that can really add to our community as well.
Another element, we talked about the mental health issue right now, right? And the connection to the pandemic and social media and the connections there. I think that right now we're in this really critical stage where, the U.S. or the Pediatric Society has said that we are in a mental health crisis for our children and youth. And yes, our schools have responded in a lot of really positive ways. But again, at this moment, I think we need to do even more. So it's things like, equipping and supporting our teachers to really address social emotional learning in the classroom, to take our kids out of that stress response so that they can actually learn, so they can do their work of like the reading, writing, and math, right? But they can't do that if they're in that trauma response, if they're responding in stress. So that's really important. But then we also have so many mental health needs that just can't be met in the classroom. So we, again, I think as a district need to be providing additional supports with mental health professionals at all of our schools. I know that we weren't able to meet those in the last year for the high demand that we had. So increasing our support of professionals to meet those needs, which then again takes the burden off of the teachers to be addressing, they're not therapists, and they also have, there's so many discipline issues that we're experiencing in the classroom right now that really need this professional support of mental health professionals. So it's wanting to support our teachers and our kids, especially in coming out of the pandemic and the trauma that we've seen, and just the mental health crisis that had been growing but was really exacerbated.
Right. So there's a lot that you already are planning for. So I'm excited for your run in November. I wish you the best of luck for it.
Thank you very much.
I hope I'll see you again at some sort of an event for that, or maybe once you're elected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Me too.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for being here today, Ruthie.
Thank
you. It was an absolute joy to talk to you, and I learned so much personally about this issue too. So I hope people will take a look at the links that we'll provide in the show notes and descriptions to get a bit more involved in Fullerton and all of these issues, and be a force of good in our community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We can all do something. So I appreciate this opportunity just to talk about these important issues. Thank you.
So thank you so much.